Oh, yeah. Let me find you.
Okay. Hey, Doug, just before you begin, can I just make a short, just a short
Go
survey?
ahead.
Okay. Uh, the so far, for the Huntington Beach art exhibit, no, okay.
All right. Basically, this presentation was put together geared towards both the seasoned photographers we have here in our group, as well as those who might not be as seasoned. If you're comfortable with your photography, then consider this a refresher course to your skills. If you're still learning photography, I hope you find some ideas to improve your skills. These tips are geared around the sayings, the best camera is the one you have with you at the time you take your picture. That includes that I put this together for cell phones as well as the people with the high-end several $1,000 cameras. And also the comment or the saying that it's not the camera, but the creative eye of the photographer which creates the image. These are designed to better understand the tools on your camera and provide ideas for your thought process when you take your photo. Now, I will remind you that if you have any questions at all, based on some of the phrasing I may use or some of the headlines or whatever on the individual slides, just go ahead and interject or comment right there at the time we're on that slide. All right, any questions before we get started? All right, this is tip number one, and I obviously titled it Know Before You Go. And I feel these are probably the basics of photography before you head out with your camera. Again, irrespective of what camera that is, a cell phone or a fancy camera. Did you do your due diligence and research the shoot location? Now, that to me is probably the highlight of this whole presentation. Before you head out, probably it benefits you to do some research and understand what there might be to shoot. It'd be kind of disheartening to travel 50 miles, 100 miles to get to a camera location. And by not doing your due diligence, just a few blocks away from where you're taking your pictures are some of the most fabulous places there is to take photographs in the area. So I'll leave that as that. Is the camera battery charged up and did you put it back in your camera after you charged it? And the hint there is obviously carry an extra battery with you because you never know how many pictures you might want to take and you may end up using that first battery. It's always comfortable to have that second battery. Do you have the memory card formatted after your last trip and is it installed the same way in the camera? Some people I've talked to in this group tends to keep their memory card full all the time of their pictures. They haven't offloaded them or they want to keep them on there, and it can get full pretty fast. So carry an extra memory card as well. And also, what I like to do is clean my camera. That includes the lens, the body, the rear finder, and that rear screen. And down at the bottom, you see I keep a lens cleaning wipe, uh, microfiber cloth, and a brush to do that. And then, of course, shoot a few test shots before you head on out just to make sure the camera's working. Now, I'm not one to harper on a particular brand of accessory or whatever, but that fine bristle brush, what I found is just an old manual shaving cream brush. And one that there you see in the right hand side. That works very well for dusting off the camera and the lens. It's about, I don't know, $6, I think, on Amazon. It's just a good old fashioned shaving brush. All right. Tip number two. This
Oh,
is probably another one that has several items underneath that title. Pre-visualize the end result.
Doug,
What I'm talking about here is you anticipate.
Question.
Yes.
if
Steve,
you don't mind me interjecting at this point, because you're on the memory cards, is you said talk about formatting them. And I've always been led to believe, and maybe you know different, that it's much better to format them in the camera than with your computer.
Absolutely.
Why?
Because the camera puts on the format that it uses. Sometimes if you try and format it in Windows or in the Apple system, sometimes it doesn't pick up the images on your camera.
The only reason I said that, Doug, is that I've done that before. It's way in the past, but the camera overrides whatever. I mean, if you do it in Windows, it's going to work. But I'm with you. I mean, I do it in camera, every time. So,
Right.
Yes, you can probably get away with it. What I found is when I had two cameras, if I got my SD cards from one camera and I put it in the other, it would be confused. So,
Same brand.
huh?
No, within even the same camera
But yeah,
manufacturer.
they were identical cameras, two Nikon D750s. And also, what a lot of people tend to do, and uh, you're perfectly free in this country to do it, but I am very much against using memory cards as storage devices.
Yep.
Agreed.
I use them as collection devices.
Well,
Well, you collect on that and then transfer it to the storage,
All right. Going back to kind of pre-visualize your image before you actually tap on the shutter release. Again, with any photograph that we're taking, your subject is the strongest thing to focus on. We're going to basically calculate the necessary field of view, which means your lens focal length needed to maximize the subject's placement within the image that you want to take. Also, before you take it, review any compositional tools or rules, they call them, to maximize attention to the primary subject, whether it's the rule of thirds or whatever. You want to use that tool to make that subject stand out. Look for any distractions, things inside the frame which would distract the viewer's eye away from your subject. And this last one I feel very important is look for the highest and the lowest exposure values inside the frame. And why I'm suggesting that is it helps the camera or helps you understand whether or not the camera exposure setting is going to fit what you want to take. And we'll talk about that going a little bit further into here, but I always do a quick look of the highest, brightest area and well as the lowest. Tip number 3, tell a story. Obviously, what it is, how do we go about telling a story? Nobody's asked that, but it starts with all photographs with the subject. And then what is the subject? What is it doing? How is it interacting with other items inside the frame? That goes along with even creating a caption if you want to put a caption on your photograph. Just tell the story. For those of you sharp-eyed viewers, you notice that I didn't quite get this photograph perfect. Well, I won't say perfect, but I didn't do a very good job. And can you tell where I screwed up?
Yes.
Where?
got his foot off.
Yeah, I cut his toes off. And I have tried every tool I could think of, Photoshop, to try and expand that down and get his toes, but they just messed up his toes every time.
Generative fill can't do it.
Pardon me?
Generative fill can't do it.
I tried that and I tried the expansion and it just wanted to mess up his toes no matter what I did.
What I've done in that situation where I've accidentally missing part of someone's foot is I make a copy of the other foot
Uh,
and then flip it and paste it.
You
yeah,
can
Use, Control T, move it around.
yeah. All right, tip number 4, compose carefully. Obviously, in this picture down at the Seal Beach Pier, that clock is probably, I think without question, the main focus of my image on this frame. I put that towards the front. It's the largest thing in the picture. I look at the lights in the background as secondary subjects, but important, as well as that young woman back along the fence line. So compose carefully. Again, everything you want to do is emphasize that main subject in your picture. Now, a lot of these seem like they're duplicates. They're probably the same thought, but a little different perspective when I put these tips together. Fill the frame. Whether you're shooting a picture like this where there's a lot of things going on, or whether you're using a minimalistic or a lot of negative space in your image, you want that subject to be the primary thing, and you want to fill as much as the frame as you can with. Check your borders, edge patrol, border patrol, whatever you want to call it. The image on the left and the image on the right are the same owl, both of them taken over here at the Nature Center of Long Beach. But as you look over the original photograph, as I was planning it, you'll notice I got a few things hanging down here. I've got this thing in the corner, this little thing with the white edge on it sticking out. I've got another branch sticking out here. Got this branch sticking out. When you're standing there laying this out, looking through your viewfinder, you got a couple of choices. If you happen to have a zoom camera or zoom lens on your camera, you're able to stay stationary, but just zoom a little bit and get rid of some of these distractions. Does anyone think that the picture on the left is actually a better photograph than the one on the right?
Yes.
You do.
Yeah, but there's a reason for it. I think now we're all very personal about these things.
Yeah.
I would have left that vertical trunk in. I would have taken that little limb out, and I would have cropped the rest away to pretty much center the subject or get it close. That's all. That's just me though. I mean, that thing's fine. The one on the right's just fine. In fact, zooming in like that is really cool.
You would leave the tree on the right edge there.
Yeah, I would. I like that. It's got some texture. It's got some focus. It's just me, man. It's just.
And it also is a framing device to bring your eye back onto the bird.
Sure. Well, yeah. I don't tend to intellectualize things that much, Doug. You know, I'm a hip shooter, man. I'm a 6-gun guy. So
I understand. Number 7, again, apply the appropriate composition tool that is hidden behind here, but it says tool. And obviously, to me, I've changed the term, the rules of composition over to tools, because I consider them tools to use to bring the viewer's eye through the image to your subject. Obviously, the image on the right with the hummingbird, that's the rule of thirds, showing I put the rule of thirds of the hummingbird's eye literally right on that edge. And the flower on the top and the flower on the bottom are still also on the rule of thirds. But these are only 7. There's obviously a lot more rules than that. But I think the rule of thirds, leading lines, framing, open space, those are probably the ones that we tend to use more often. Number 6 is where you put the focus point. We'll talk about that in a second. And the horizons level and verticals upright. It's a personal thing. I see way too many photographs of an ocean or a viewpoint going out, looking over the sea or whatever, where the horizon level is not, the horizon line, excuse me, is not level. And I just cringe when I see that. And the same thing when verticals aren't upright. Now, that's just me, but I do think that we can take more time and do what we can to make the horizons level and the verticals upright. I think they improve your image a little bit. Now, I understand there's creative aspects involved where a lot of people tend to shoot off center, off to the horizon line, not level. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about if you're taking a picture of a boat out on the ocean and your horizon line is not level, I think you're taking away from your subject just a little bit. Look for the gesture in your subject, particularly if your subject is a person or an animal. If you'll notice the bighorn sheep over here on the left, these guys have been butting horns for the last half hour. I think there was 9 or 10 times they whacked each other, but you can tell by their eyes they're not finished. They're still working on dominance between the two of them. The black crowned night heron on the right side over the garbage can, could have taken a picture of it just sitting there on the side of the can, but here he was talking. He was making a noise, whether it was at me or whatever, but looks a little different, I think a little better to have some type of gesture going on in your subject.
Also, I think you did the right amount of cropping with that garbage can. I think if you had any more of the trash can, it wouldn't look right, but this looks fine.
Thank you. Yeah, there actually wasn't much over there because there was a tree to the left of the trash can.
Yeah, until you called it a trash can, I thought it was a little bird bath.
No, it's actually a trash can. That was over in the area where the duck pond is off of Studebaker Road. All right, draw the maximum attention to your subject. I think that's probably vital that we should take with every picture we have. Nothing wrong necessarily with the squirrel on the left. However, there's an awful lot of stuff either in the front of him as well as the back. The lighting on the back is bright, which naturally draws your eye away from it. The brighter leaves in the front the same way. The squirrel on the right-hand side, use a little better depth of field to get rid of that background, which happened to be more rocks and the ocean. He's standing on a rock. Again, you would say that's probably gesture. There's even some gesture in the squirrel on the left. He was looking at me. The one on the looking for a handout, I think. The one on the right obviously was making some noise, chattering noise. Again, there's that gesture in the photograph as well. After you've taken your shot, number 10 is crop for maximum attention to your subject. If you did it before you hit the shutter release, it would be frame your subject. In this case, once I shot it, this obviously, again, gesture, you've got the young lady here kind of getting a little angry or telling off this gentleman on the right. But there's a lot of things as we did our edge patrol that are kind of in the way. So what I did is I cropped it down in the picture on the right, got rid of this section over here, got rid of this section over here, some of the top, which is distracting a little bit, and even some of the bottom with the shadows and the feet. So we ended up here with a little more, I think, cohesive image where you're looking at more of the subject is what my intention was when I laid the picture out. Again, you can do this by a couple ways. If you happen to have a zoom lens, you're able to stand where you are and zoom in a little bit. Or after you've taken it, you find out you need to eliminate some of it around the edges. That's where you do your cropping and your post-processing. Number 11, wait for it. I would suggest that you keep shooting. Why do I say that? Because the next photo you might take could be the best one of the whole day. This young lady, this squirrel here, was scratching her side of her face. I was taking several pictures, but all of a sudden she turned and I moved just a little bit. And this picture, again, we look for gesture. This is cool, but I think this is better. I would put the caption on this picture on the right, photographers give me a headache. I think by where the placement of that paw is, or kind of depicts that headache aspect as opposed to this one over here. This is more of an itch over here on the right, left. So I say keep shooting. It might be the best picture of the whole day.
Doug,
Sir?
recently, within the last couple of years, because our film is so cheap, and because of what you're talking about here, I always have my camera at a minimum of 5 frames a second.
Yep.
And that way, like you said, the third or fourth frame or fifth might be better.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, I do the same thing, and I do a burst, and I do it a lot because of that first one may not be as sharp. I may have had just a little bit of camera movement when I pressed a little too aggressively on the shutter release. But once it was down and it did a burst of 3 to 5 pictures, the ones in the middle might be a lot sharper. Good point, Stephen. Thanks. Seek separation with your subject. Now, when I first started talking, I mentioned that this presentation was to include everything from iPhones or cell phones, excuse me, not a particular brand, cell phones, all the way through the fancy multiple $1,000 cameras. This is a cell phone image. And we've got separation of the caterpillar, both in front of the background. The background's disturbed or blurred, so that's not as predominant. We got the yellow flower. Notice that this caterpillar is eating the flowers. Look how much is not left, and look how much where it started from. So this guy was eating quite a bit of that edge of that flower. But again, try and get some separation. You can use the tools of your depth of field. You can use the closeness, how close you are, or your zoom lens to help that, your aperture to blur out some of the background. So you have tools available to help pull your separation from your subject away from the background, and even in this case, away from the foreground. Any questions so far as the concepts that I'm talking about? Am I making myself clear enough for you?
Yes.
yes.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Now, on the second slide, I talked about getting look at the maximum brightest part of your picture and the darkest part of your picture. The purpose of this particular tip number 13 is to double check your exposure. In this particular case, I am talking about what your camera does when it exposes the exposure of your image. All of these cameras that we use, cell phone or whatever, are reflective light metering systems. What do I mean by that? Your light source, whether it's a light or whether it's the sun or whatever it might be, when it shines down on your subject, whether it's in this case a single cat or whether it's a sunset or whether it's a landscape, the light reflecting back towards the camera is called reflective light. And your camera takes that information, reads that information, and it sets the exposure inside the camera when you take the picture. Now, what does it do? It takes those bright areas that I talked about and the dark areas, and it tends to average them out to the middle, which is called middle gray or 18% gray. Now, the brightest part of your picture and the darkest part of your picture is called the dynamic range of that. If your subject, be it in this case the black cat, or if it's a darker area, maybe there's a lot of information in the shade, it will take those darkest parts, and instead of averaging them out to the middle, it will try and force that to the middle. And in the process, it overexposes your picture because it's trying to bring the darker aspects of your picture or the darker overall aspect of your image up to this 18% gray. So it moves it on over here, overexposing it. On the opposite side, if you've got a lot of bright or whiter areas in your image, say for an example, this white cat here, again, that's a lot of reflected light coming back into the camera. The camera takes that excess, if you will, excess bright light, and it tones it down to this middle gray, and your picture will be underexposed. One example I like to use here, if you're out in the winter and you've got a lot of snow on your ground and you're trying to take a picture of some of your friends or whatever it is around the snow, that's an ideal situation for it to be underexposed because the camera wants to bring that down to 18% gray. And then when the camera averages out all of the highs and the lows and in between and it gets a mid-tone image, then your exposure is going to be right. Now, with the new cameras that we have nowadays, probably 80 or 90% of the time, your camera is going to do an excellent job of exposing. It's that other 15, maybe 10% of the time where you've got a unique situation. That's why I said check for the highlights, check for the shadows, make sure there's not going to be something out of whack, that you may need to use your exposure compensation on your camera to bring these down to where you want them. If you're using your histogram on the back of the camera, in the case of the histogram on a dark subject, you'll find on the edge of the histogram that there'll be a big long line or peak right at the far left-hand edge of your image. If you have a lot of highlights, it'll be over here with this peak way over here on the right-hand side. There's a phrase that says exposed for the right or exposed to the right. Generally, if you have your exposure and you have a lot of highlights and you've got your peaks off the edge, you have taken away all of the detail in your highlights. It's just never going to come back no matter what you try and do in post. It's better to bring that down before you take the picture by adjusting your exposure compensation, underexpose a little bit, just to get those peaks down here at the bottom, not up on along the edge. And you can generally recover the shadows a little better than you can. Once it's blurred out or burnt out on the top side, you'll never get it back.
Well, Doug,
Sir?
just one example. If I'm taking a picture and there's a bright sky, I will go minus 0.3 or 0.7, or actually I do both.
Yep.
So
That's in the camera,
yeah, in the camera.
not post-processing, right?
Right.
Yeah, once you burn out the highlights, you're not going to bring those back in post. That could be a waterfall, the highlights, the dappling in a waterfall, as Stephen mentions, the sky. There's a tool on your camera, exposure compensation. Just understand how that the camera works when it does what it does when it makes exposure. You got a lot of dark in it, it's probably going to increase and overexpose. If you got a lot of light, it's going to underexpose. All right, again, watch your backgrounds. Picture here on the left, got a harlequin bug. You got this little section here of overexposed, or actually just a white area in the background, kind of distracting, and also your eye is naturally drawn to the lighter area in your pictures. It's often just a slight shift of your position can make a big difference in the photograph itself. I've got your back lighting. We've talked before that there's generally 3 areas where the lighting can be. Front lighting, where the light source is at your back. Side lighting, where it's to the side of the camera. And then back lighting, as you see here in these 2 photographs, where the light source is actually behind the subject. And what it does is it brings some very helpful rim lighting around your subject, and it also brings some interesting highlights and shadows onto your subject. In this case, you got to be careful because often when you are into backlighting situations, you can get some diffraction or highlights in your image that are due to the light coming through the various elements of your lens. And in this case, it put that spot right there on it. So you got to be careful about that. But backlighting, I think, can be your friend. You can get some very nice images with backlighting to bring out texture and the contrast between your highlights and your shadows. Tip number 16, set your focus point where you want it. Don't rely on the camera to put it where it wants. We've had this discussion many times before. Here we have 61 focus points on this particular camera that I was using. It focused right here on this moth. Here it focused right on the eye of the squirrel, which is anytime you've got an eye, whether it's a human or an animal, you want that focus point to be right on the eye. The way your camera works, and cameras are always improving, generally, as long as something is in the focus range of the lens, your automatic focus will focus on the closest thing to the camera inside the focal range, as long as it's inside the focal range. So when you're looking through it and you press your shutter halfway down, make sure that you get the focus point that the camera is selecting is where you want it on your main subject. The newer cameras where they have the eye focus and that kind of thing going on, the newer cameras, a lot of that is taken care of because the camera is selecting the eye where you don't have to. But if your camera is older than 5 years where you don't have the new focus features, you're going to have to make sure that when it shows you in the finder what it's focusing on, make sure you put it where you want it.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, Kevin?
I'm currently having issues trying to figure out how to get myself back into this. I tend to follow recommendations for doing camera setups for different types of photography. And I set the focus thing up differently, and I can't figure out how to get back. When you have that big, broad range of squares on your screen, how do you select the one that you want to use?
All right, in automatic, when you go ahead and hold the shutter release down, one of these focus points is going to change color, which is notifying you that that's where the focus point is going on right now.
Yeah.
And what you're going to have to do, if it picked a spot over here, you're going to have to move the camera to kind of, if that's where it is, you're probably going to have to keep putting the shutter release down a couple times to try and force it to be over here.
Oh, okay.
Now, I've told you before in the past that I don't use all, in this case, 61 focus points. I only set my camera to use just one. And that is the one in the center.
I do the same.
So when I go ahead and hit that shutter release down part way to activate the shutter, it's going to start with just one point, and I put it exactly where I want it when I go ahead and move the camera to compose the image. Now, I know that you got a Sony, and John has John Boland have a Sony, and they don't really make that very easy for you in your menu setups to find that.
Comment? Hello?
Pardon me?
Comment. Something that gets kind of lost in the translation when we're talking autofocus is manual focus. And if you take the time with your various lenses, because they're all a little bit different, I find that, like in the situation where you're a squirrel sitting there, of course, with my Nikon, I don't see all those little squares, but I will automatically go to manual focus. But I use a couple of lenses primarily when I'm out shooting wildlife or whatever, and I know exactly where it is. I know where my hand is on the lens, and it's really easy to dial in.
Now, Charlie, what camera are you using at the time you're talking about here?
I'm on a Z9 pretty much all the time now, and I got a couple of long lenses. I have the 180-600 and the 100-400, which I really like, both of them.
I'm assuming that the Z9 has focus peaking as well.
Oh yeah,
yeah, that is definitely a plus on the newer cameras. That focus peaking, where you're actually going to see in the finder what is actually going to be in focus when you manually focus.
I don't use it though. The Sonys have a better concept. But I don't use that.
Right.
I just try to get it in focus and go on, and that's
Yeah.
just my
Yeah,
concept.
manual focus is always an opportunity, but I will tell you that when I switched from film to excuse me, digital, I never found manual focus to be, to me, the accuracy I needed to focus it. I actually felt better on automatic focus once I understood how to cheat the system, if you will, and put it to exactly where I want it.
Yeah, you're right, but I'm talking in particular just for instances like that squirrel, and you got the leaves in the way and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
if you're goofing around trying to find a focus point and all that kind of stuff, I'll just go ahead and no, I'll get it, and
Sure.
it works really, really well because the focus point on the camera will become green on mine anyway, and I'll know exactly. I'll know I'm right there. Of course, I can see it.
Yeah, my Canon is blue.
So,
Yeah, good
Doug,
point.
Doug,
Go
you're
ahead.
coming tomorrow?
Pardon me?
You're coming to the meeting tomorrow?
Yeah.
Maybe I can go over this with you at the meeting just to see what your camera shows and how you set it up versus mine.
Okay.
Are you so?
I was going to ask some questions here today, but let's move on, and I'll talk about it with you tomorrow.
Okay. I'll bring my camera.
All right.
Charlie, were you going to add something else?
No, I just wondered what you're shooting, Canon or Sony,
I'm shooting Canon.
and so we got a nice blend here in the group.
Yeah.
All right. If only I understood ISO. A lot of us understand the exposure triangle, but we sort of leave in this case, the bottom part out of it because we don't really know what ISO does or what it's there to do. If you can remember back to my fall color presentation where I took the shot of the Convict Lake where there was a lot of wind going on that day and the waves were kicking up, but I had a foreground with the trees in the foreground that I needed to have in depth of field to get the foreground and the background in, but I had to have a higher shutter speed to stop the water motion. Well, those two things are counterproductive, and at some point in time, I can't get enough aperture or I can't speed up the shutter speed. I've got to use the third leg over here, which is ISO. And the ISO kind of functions as the volume control on your radio. It's there to increase call it the amplification or the light amplification going onto your sensor. When you have a lot of light, you don't need normally to do a lot of ISO, but all three of these things all have their benefits, but they also have their problems to solve. If you have too slow a shutter speed and you're trying to hold your camera still, too slow a shutter speed, oops, you're going to get camera blur. If you have your lens wide open to get enough light in there to get the exposure properly, unfortunately, you may not have as much depth of field as you want. So you have benefits and you have some negatives. With the case of our ISO, the benefit is we're able to amplify the signal and get our exposure up to how we need it. But the downside is you're going to pick up what they call noise, or in the old days of film, it was grain. The higher you go on your ISO, the more grain or noise you're going to get. If your camera is probably 5 years old or older, generally you can probably go to about 800 or 1600 on your ISO before the grain is just too much or the noise is too much and it downgrades the sharpness of your image. If you've got one of the newer cameras in the last 3 to 5 years, you can probably go to 6400 and maybe even 1200 without too much noise. And I'm going to say, yes, there is software out there, noise reduction software that has made a lot of difference in getting rid of that noise while still keeping your sharpness. But I'm just talking about in general. If your camera's older than 5 years, be careful when you get over 1600. And if you have one of the newer cameras, the newer sensors, you're probably good to 1200 or so. Any questions on ISO? Any comments on ISO?
Well, maybe you want to address automatic ISO one of these days.
Yeah, I can. Automatic, what he's talking about with automatic ISO is your camera can set aperture, shutter speed, or ISO automatically. It's truly automatic exposure, if you will. Or you can set the camera to one of the other three, all three, one of those into a priority. You can use aperture priority, where the aperture is a choice that you make, whether it's f8, 5.6, f22, and the other two, shutter speed and ISO, if you have it set, will automatically go. If you do the shutter speed, the same thing. The aperture and the ISO are going to move. If you set ISO to automatic, you can set the range at which it will choose. If you have one of the older cameras, you can set the range to go no higher than 1600.
Right.
If you have one of the newer cameras, you can set the range up to a maximum of what you feel gives you the amount of grain which is acceptable, but at some point when it goes over that acceptable level, your sharpness and your image gets degraded.
I believe my camera, I set it a minimum 100 and adjust up as needed.
Up as needed?
Yeah.
Okay.
See, with me, I'll use auto ISO almost exclusively, and I get so lazy that sometimes I just leave it on it. But for sports and movement, anything moving, it is super handy. I can set my shutter, I can set my aperture, and I just let the camera handle everything else, and I can get rid of anything else in post. But
Roger.
I'm usually very judicious about it and understand pretty much the range of where I'm going.
I understand.
Yeah, that comes with a little technique training when you train your.
It's experience. It comes with practice.
Yeah. Also, you can go on YouTube with some cameras and the models, and there'll be somebody who has analyzed the sharpness of the ISO settings. They'll show you what the differences between 200, 400, 1600, and so on.
Yeah.
And you can tell when you're going to get into trouble with too much noise on your particular model. It's real helpful.
Yeah, as Charlie was talking about, and I do it too. I just basically go out and practice. I keep moving it, taking the same picture, and I review the images on my computer.
Yeah.
All right. Capture the mood.
Yeah.
Just going to ask the question. Did anybody just get chills from that snow there?
From what?
The snow?
I see it. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously timing has a lot to do with our photographs. And if we happen to be there when the clouds are either arriving ahead of a storm or going away after the storm, they can add a lot of mood to your image.
Yep.
So look for that look for the mood in your pictures and try and capture it on your film or on your on your sensor. All right, number 19. We're about ready to wrap up here. Process, but don't over process. Same image. Obviously, I'm in Zion. I was trying to bring out on a cloudy day some detail in the clouds. I could do that by bringing the contrast up, but unfortunately, it really, really cooked the rest of the image. Now, obviously, for those people that have some of the tools like Lightroom and things like that, you can use a mask and just highlight this area within the mask and bring this area down. But generally, what you don't want to do is just simply over process your image to where it starts to look, I call it chunky, or doesn't look right. To
Right.
me, one of the first tools that is overused is probably the sharpness tool. Trying to make up either for maybe the grain or a grain on your higher ISO, or whether it's just camera motion, you got a little too slow shutter speed. Probably the biggest tool to have the tool that has the biggest effect if it's overused is sharpness. You'll start to get really chunky edges on things and it just doesn't look right. So, all right. Foregrounds. Foregrounds are just as important in your photograph as the subject is. What you're trying to do with a foreground is frame the image so that your viewer's eye stays on your subject. Yeah, I could have cropped this right across here, but it takes a little away that, hey, this was low tide. It's part of my story. It's low tide. And this is a shipwreck. It's actually a fake one, but it's a shipwreck. It's not fake. It was actually a wreck, but the city of Cayucas uses it now as a tourist attraction. Here we have the glass blower shop in Harmony, California, an old building. By putting in the foreground this truck, you put a little extra part on your story or picture. If you do use the foreground, you're probably best to make sure it's in just as good a focus as your background is or your main subject is. You can sometimes let it go out of focus, like we did on that caterpillar on the munching on the flower. That foreground was out of focus, but most of the time you want that foreground to be in focus, and if you can, shoot low on it so that it doesn't protrude too far into your subject, particularly if you're taking landscapes. All right, probably my last tip, and I hope everybody understands what I mean. Have fun. Yeah, there's a lot of things to think about going through all 20 of these things. And when you're standing there and getting ready to take a picture, it's not a matter of, do I go through all 20 as a checklist? In the meantime, this little Bambi is bouncing all over the place, but you missed the shot because you're worried too much about the hardware and the software and what to do. Practice, but just go ahead and have fun. Any last questions?
I'd like to thank you, Doug, for putting this on. I know how much work went into it. At least I got a good idea. And it's very good work, man.
Thank you. I'll have one last
Yes.
question. This was actually a quiz, this last photograph. I know we're out of time, Skip. Can you identify any of the items 1 through 20 that actually I've applied to these photographs individually?
Timing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mood,
Yeah.
tell a story,
Yeah. Depth of field.
Gesture.
separate the subject,
Mhm.
focus on the subject, exposure, process, don't process, over process, excuse me,
No,
compose carefully,
Yeah.
check your borders. I have it number 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, and 19 could probably apply to this photograph, or these 3 photographs.
Mhm.
So if you review it online, when Steve puts it up on the Facebook, or on the page, on the YouTube page, maybe when you go through it, keep that in mind.
Mhm.
This is obviously Fawn's. This is up in Pacific Grove. This little rascal just running around having a heck of a fun day. Okay.
All right.
Any questions?
Fantastic.